All right. This week's Sedra is Parshas Veira, and last week's Sedra, at the end of the Sedra in Parshas Shmos. So the Torah tells us that Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that Moshe complains to Hakadosh Baruch Hu, and he says, "Me'oz basi al Paroh heira lo mazeh v'lo mazeh shlachani." Why did you send me? The situation became worse from the moment I got involved. So why? What was the purpose in my coming? So the Torah says here that in this week's Sedra that God answers Moshe. And he mentions, in other words, it's sort of like the avos, the patriarchs. I answered them, and they call, when the patriarchs knew that they would not see the fulfillment of the commitment, but nevertheless they didn't complain. And you, Moshe, who I told will see the fulfillment of the commitment. You complain, and then he says, so God says to Moshe, "Bo daber al Paro melech Mitzrayim, go speak to Paro, the king of Egypt, v'yishalech es Bnei Yisrael me'artzo, and he will send the Jewish people from the land." Vayadabra Moshe lefnei Hashem lemor, God spoke to Moshe saying, Moshe spoke to God saying, if the Jewish people didn't listen to me, so how do you expect Paro to listen to me? Now the Torah tells us, why didn't the Jewish people listen to Moshe? The Jewish people were not receptive to Moshe because mikotza ruach me'avoda kasha, because of the hard work, the labor that they were forced to do, the shortness of breath, because of their servile condition, they did not respond positively to Moshe's to Moshe giving them over the message of God. So the Rashi says that here, where Moshe tells God that Hein Bnei Yisrael lo shumalai, it's an argument of logic. Moshe is making an argument of logic, and these are the type of logical arguments that are very used often in the Torah. 10 times in the Torah they're mentioned explicitly, this type of logical argument. And it's also one of the drushos that we use. Sometimes we derive from a principle of less severe to the more severe. So Moshe said to God, the Jewish people didn't listen to me. So how do you expect Paro to listen to me? So there's a question that everybody asks, because the situation was not the exact same. The Jewish people didn't listen to Moshe. Why? Because mikotza ruach me'avoda kasha, because they were enslaved. They had the burdens of slavery upon themselves. They weren't able to deal with changing conditions, because all the changing conditions made their situation worse. But certainly that wasn't the issue with Paro. Paro was the enslaver. Paro had the ability to think of changing conditions. So what's the kal v'chomer? What's the logical argument? So I think, and this is a question that is asked by many of the commentaries on Rashi in the Torah, but I think the answer is very simple. It's based although my father didn't discuss this pasuk, in Parshas Shalach. So in Perek Yud Gimel pasuk Lamed Beis, Lamed Gimel, excuse me. So the spies that were sent by Moshe, and then came back with a report that the Jewish people would never be able to take possession of the land of Canaan because the Canaanites were of superior strength and would easily resist the invasion of the Jewish people. So they said, "V'shomrinu es Nephilim." We saw there the Nephilim, Bnei Anak, the giants, Bnei Nephilim, Bani ve'enenu. We saw giants over there, and we were in our own eyes, kachagavim, like grasshoppers. V'chein hayinu beinehem, and so we were in their own eyes. And I heard from my father many times that in other words, two things I mentioned. First of all, there was the self-perception. The self-perception was that we, in comparison to them, are like grasshoppers. And as a result of that self-perception, and similarly we were in their eyes. It doesn't say we were grasshoppers in their eyes, and therefore we were grasshoppers in our own eyes. But v'chein hayinu b'neihem, because there is an idea of a self-perception that the enemy very much is influenced by the self-perception of the Jew. If the Jew considers himself strong and mighty, then they're less likely to fight with the Jew. But if the Jew himself has a very bad self-perception, he considers himself weak. He doesn't think that he can overtake the enemy, or he's scared of the enemy. That emboldens the enemy. It was our self. So the Meraglim said, we saw ourselves as grasshoppers, and the truth came out of their mouth, and therefore they see us as grasshoppers. So our self-perception plays a role in the attitude that our enemies have against us. And to a certain degree, I think that perhaps, it's an aside comment, but to a certain degree, when the United States gives the impression of being weak, that has an impact on those who otherwise would be fearful of the United States. But this is certainly true in regard to the Jewish people. So now, if the Jewish people cannot perceive themselves as being free, as being in control, in control of being under the dominion and the control of the Egyptians certainly could not conceive themselves letting the Jewish people leave their control. So this was the Kal V'chomer. The Kal V'chomer was, we see that the Jewish people cannot perceive themselves being free. Yes, because of Kotzer Ruach Me'avoda Kosher. But because the Jewish people had that bad self-perception. So because of that, the because of that, the Egyptians, halachas kama, much more so, could not perceive themselves as letting the Jewish people go. But the question is, what was the answer? This is a logical question that Moshe Rabbeinu asked of Paroh, asked of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It was a logical question. The question is, what was the answer to this question? Now, when we take a look at the Torah, Vaydaber Hashem al Moshe v'Aaron vayitzavein el Bnei Yisrael v'al Paroh melech Mitzrayim lahotzi es Bnei Yisrael meretz Mitzrayim. God said, God told Moshe and Aaron, command that they should command the Jewish people in God's name to give command to the Jewish people and to Paroh to let the Jewish people go out of Egypt. Now, so there doesn't seem to be an answer to the question. What is the answer here? Now, my father said, I'll suggest an answer at the end of the share, a different answer. But my father suggested an answer that, in a sense, there is no answer. Just do it. What's the answer? The answer is, you're asking a logical question. If the Jewish people didn't listen to me, how do you expect Paroh to listen to me? And the answer is the survival of the Jew, the destiny of the Jew, defies logic. So that's why there is no real answer given. Just go ahead and command the Jewish people and command Paroh, and we can say that that's part of the answer. Never mind logic. Go ahead. Now, now this idea that the survival of the Jew and the destiny of the Jew defies logic is an idea that is expressed by the Maharal in other words. The Maharal regarding, and it has a foundation in the Ramban's Perush and Chumash. The Maharal says, in regard to Hanukkah, he discusses from a Kabbalah perspective, from a mystical perspective, what is the significance of Hanukkah being 8 days? And he says 7 days from a Kabbalah perspective represents nature, because creation took place over a period of 7 days. 8, according to the Maharal, represents going above nature. And he says in regard to Hanukkah, I mentioned it in one of the Shirim on Hanukkah, that in a sense, when the Jewish people fought with the Greeks, a person could have thought that the victory of the Greeks was not miraculous. Even though it's Rabbi Yamatim, but a person could have thought, perhaps intentionally, but the person could have thought, it could have suggested that it was not miraculous. They could have attributed it to the intelligence of the Jew. I remember after the 6-Day War, when you had all these armies of the Arabs, and I'm sure I wasn't born yet, that the same argument was made probably during the War for Independence, when the number of Arab soldiers was so many more and better armed than the Jewish soldiers. And when you talk to people about the nature of the miracle, I remember when I was in Israel sometime after the war, and there was a discussion going on. It was in a restaurant, and in another table, there were some kiruv workers who were talking with someone who apparently was not observant, and they were trying to impress on them the miraculous nature of the 6-Day War. And the response, I overheard the response of the person that they were trying to be mekarev was, well, the Israelis were more intelligent. They understood better the art of war. They had more experience. So because of that, undoubtedly, there were those who said that in the time of the victory of the Hashmonaim, even though it was Rabbi Miyad Ma'atim, and it was trained soldiers of the strongest army that existed at that time. And who led the battle of the Jewish people? The Kohanim, who up to that point really did not serve in the Jewish army. But nevertheless, people are always looking for excuses to hide God and perhaps to give credit. Not that they aren't deserving of credit, they certainly are deserving of credit to the Jewish soldiers, but they use the credit they give to the Jewish soldiers as a reason to belittle the role that God played in the victory of the Jewish people. And so because of that, the Maharal says it was necessary for the miracle of the candles, which lasted 8 days, when there was only oil for 1 day, to show that the miracle of Hanukkah defied nature, not only in regard to the oil, but the message was that there was a defiance of nature in the war of the Greeks as well. And he says 8 represents going over teva, going over nature, defying nature. And then he says, and in regard to Hanukkah, we perhaps could understand this message, but he gives other examples of it. And I had a lot of trouble understanding the other examples. Now, one example he gave was the counting of the 7 weeks of Sphira. And then we have Kabbalas Torah. Then we have the acceptance of Torah, the giving of the Torah. And when we have the giving of the Torah, so that represents going above nature. The 7 weeks, that represents nature itself. So the question is, how do we see that as going above nature, that the Torah is going above nature? Now, according to the Rambam's opinion, we could perhaps understand it. There is a machlokas, a dispute between the Rambam and the other commentaries regarding miracles in general. Now, but I want to preface it with a certain question that was once asked to me by a cousin of mine who passed away a number of years ago. His yard site was this past Friday, Dov Pluznik, and a very, very fine person, a very smart person, and he was a scientist, and he was troubled, and he was a very deeply religious person. And he asked me a question. He says, in Tehillim Kuf Lamed Vav, we say it every Shabbos, Tahal Hagadol, Hodel Hashem Ki Tov Kilom Chasto. It mentions, first of all, how God created the world, and then it discusses the miracles of Yetzias Mitzrayim, L'makeh Mitzrayim b'choreihem, Vayotze Yisrael mitocham, V'yot Chazaka Zro Netuya. And his question was, and it goes about all the events that took place, many of the events that took place in the Midbar, in the desert. A matter of fact, it's brought down in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Chassid that this tefillah was really written, this kapitel Tehillim, before it was put in Tehillim, was really written by Moshe Rabbeinu. And each time there was another miraculous event that took place in the Midbar, that took place in the desert. So another line would be added. And the question but the greatest miracle of all was the miracle of Matan Torah, of the giving of the Torah. And why is it that Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, is not mentioned at all? That was the greatest miracle. L'gozi yamsum l'gzarem, b'hebi Yisrael b'socho, b'nei Paroh b'chel b'yamsuf, l'mo l'chamo b'midbar. He took us through the desert, l'makeh melachim dolim, v'yorg melachim adirim sichon, l'sichon melech hamori. Why isn't Matan Torah mentioned here? And I said to him that according to the opinion of the Rambam, we could understand it, because there is a dispute between the Rambam and the other Rishonim, and the other between not just the Rishonim, almost all the Mekubalim. So, what the nature of miracle? What is the nature of miracle versus nature? According to the Rambam, all the miracles that took place throughout the history of the Jewish people was, in a sense, programmed, if I could use that word, that all those miracles were programmed into nature. All those miracles were programmed into nature. Matter of fact, the Medrash says that when God made a differentiation between the waters and the land. So God, T'nai Hisna, he made a condition that the waters should split, not just at that time to separate, to show the land, but when the Jewish people come to the Yam Suf, so then too, the land should be seen to allow the Jewish people to go through the Yam Suf. The Rambam says this in his Parish and Pirkei Avos, that all the miracles were programmed into creation. And there were 10 miracles that were Ben Hashmashos. And whereas the other Mekubalim, so in a sense, all the miracles were part of nature. Now we have to understand the Rambam's opinion, because if all the miracles were programmed into nature, so then why do we daven? What's the purpose of being mispalel? Everything is already taken care of. And how do we understand the concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? This attitude would be a limitation on the concept of HaKadosh Baruch Hu as being a koach havaya. How are we to understand all of this? And then the other shitos are just the opposite of the Rambam. The other opinions are that there is no such thing as nature. Everything is miraculous. The world, Hamachadesh Betuvo B'chol Yom Tamid, is not just that God expands the world or adds to the world, but literally every moment he is renewing the world. He is recreating the world, yesh meyayin. Also difficult for us to understand. Now, in regard to the Rambam, I think the explanation is the following. Every once in a while, you see scientists come up with all kinds of papers trying to explain the different miracles on the basis of the laws of nature. Freak accidents that take place. There are freak accidents that take place. Winds blow one way, you have earthquakes, tsunamis, and sometimes this just happens to work out in such a way that it'll be a salvation. Usually these freaks of nature cause additional problems, but sometimes the different forces of nature come together in such a way to allow something that we consider miraculous in the positive sense, and that offers a salvation for the Jew and for mankind. So it's conceivable that according to the Rambam, we could suggest when it says God made a t'nai, made a condition with nature, that means God, who knows everything, created the world in such a way that when the different forces of nature come together, they will come together in such a way that we will have a miraculous event. But who brings these forces of nature together? It doesn't happen by itself. It's God who brings these forces of nature together. And I think that's what the Rambam means. The Rambam is telling us that T'nai Hisna Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's not that it happens automatically, but God, who's the Koach Havaya, who gives the world its existence, he is the one that brings the forces of nature together in such a way that the miracle should take place. But all this, these forces of nature were created at the time of creation in order that the miracle should take place later. And I think, so what I suggested to my cousin at that time was, I remember I once asked my father, according to the Rambam's opinion, what about Matan Torah? Is Matan Torah also, the Matan Torah, is that part of the laws of nature or not? And my father said, no. Matan Torah is an exception. God appearing to the Jewish people in the way he did in Matan Torah could not be explained on the basis of the laws of nature. That was a defiance of the laws of nature. So I said to my cousin that that's the reason, perhaps, why Matan Torah is not mentioned here. Because Halal Hagadol deals with those events that on one hand, and you can see the whole trend in there, and connecting Yetzias Mitzrayim to the creation and the traversing of the desert also. These are miracles that came about through creation. But when we look at the miracles, why is it that we say Hallel if it's part of nature? But it's clear that yes, all the miracles are by the laws of nature, but it's only because God brought the laws of nature in such a way together that the miracle was created. In other words, when we perceive something being irregular, God generally controls the world pretty much in more or less the same way each day. But when there is a special need, the laws of nature are manipulated by HaKadosh Baruch Hu in such a way to bring about a miracle. The scientists certainly don't understand it completely, but the general idea works according to the Rambam's opinion. So I think, that's why it's mentioned here that that's why Matan Torah is not mentioned in the Halal Hagadol, because the Halal Hagadol, it talks about God within nature, and even though it has the appearance of being outside nature. And I think that perhaps the idea of Sfiras Omer being 7 weeks and then followed Matan Torah being above nature could be understood with the opinion of the Rambam. In other words, 7 weeks, 7 represents nature. And weeks also emphasizes the idea of nature. But Matan Torah is above nature. Why? Because the miracle of nature, the Matan Torah, was the one miracle that was completely above nature. The only thing is that I do not believe that the Maharal had the opinion of the Rambam. So what we could say is that there is a difference, and in other words, the Maharal probably went with the opinion of the Mekubalim that there is no such thing as nature, that everything is miraculous. So then the question is, so if everything is miraculous, so why do we have a difference between Halal Gadol, Halal Mitzri? Why is it that we say Halal Pesach night? Of course, we also say Halal Gadol Pesach night. I once mentioned that the beginning of Halal Pesach night, that represents the miracles that we perceive, that's seeing the miracles from the perspective of being miraculous. But when we say it in Halal Hagadol, there we're seeing it as being part of nature. When we stand at the event itself, and there is a change, we have a different perception. But later on, perhaps, we come to realize that this miracle was actually part of nature also. So in other words, everything is miraculous. but we have to say there is a different perception. What defines the difference between miracle and nature? According to the others, those who disagree with the Rambam, it's only perception. But even within the miracles of perception, there is a difference between all the other miracles and the miracles of Matan Torah as well. The other miracles could perhaps be under the miracle of Matan Torah stands out as being totally miraculous, beyond God working with the laws of nature. Whereas in other words, God might create new laws of nature to perform the miracle. The miracle of Matan Torah is not the laws of nature. It's beyond that. And I think that perhaps that's the reason why Matan Torah also is not mentioned here. But and we could suggest that according to the Maharal, that when he says 7 weeks is nature, even though nature, there is no such thing as nature, but there is a perception of nature. But Matan Torah, there isn't even a perception. There isn't even a perception of nature. And when it comes, the Maharal also applies it to Sukkos. Why does he apply it to Sukkos? And he applies it to Bris Milah also. Bris Milah, the mitzvah of circumcision is on the 8th day. Why does he apply it to Sukkos? Sukkos is 7 days, and then the 8th day is Shmini Atzeres. He says Shmini Atzeres represents going above nature. How is it going above nature, Sukkos? I mean, Shmini Atzeres. How is Shmini Atzeres going above nature? But I think the idea is when you take a look at Sukkos, on Sukkos, there were korbanos, there were sacrifices given on behalf of the nations of the world. On Shmini Atzeres, the sacrifice that was given was only for the Jewish people. One bull was offered on the Mizbeach, was offered on the altar, representing the Jewish people, a sacrifice on behalf of the Jewish people. On the other days, there was a total of 70 bulls that were offered as sacrifices on behalf of the nations of the world. There's a medrash that says that if the nations of the world realized the impact that these sacrifices had for them, they would never have destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. But in Shmini Atzeres, only one bull was offered. That was a sacrifice on behalf of the Jewish people. That was a private, personal holiday. It was just God and the Jewish people. It was focused on that personal relationship. How are we to understand it? But we understand it very simply. I think there is a difference between the nations of the world and the Jewish people. The nations of the world, just like we have laws of physical nature, just like we have a law that dictates that the moon comes out or is seen at night, and the sun is seen in the day, and rain comes from the clouds, and there are stars in the sky that emanate small amounts of light at night, or that we see their light at night. So there are laws of history as well. Just like there's a law of gravity, there are laws of history. But the laws of history do not apply to the Jewish people in the same manner that they apply to the nations of the world. And Moshe, at the time of the Bris Bein Habsarim, according to the Medrash, Avram Avinu was told by God that whereas the nations of the world, and perhaps him up till that time, was controlled by the stars, the Jewish people from that time onward, Abraham will not be controlled by the stars. Now, I don't think that you have to take this medrash literally, that the stars actually control people. But the stars represent nature. And to a certain degree, history is controlled by nature, because there are laws of history. The demise of the Jewish people would have happened long ago had the Jewish people been subject to the laws of nature. In our own lifetime, how many times was it predicted that the Jewish people would cease to exist as a nation? And that's with the state of Israel. And certainly beforehand, that it was thought that way. And how many times, even within Judaism, among the Jewish people themselves, was there a prediction that compliance with the Torah, communities dedicated to observance, communities that are devout in their worship of God, would cease to exist. They couldn't exist with changing times. How many people thought after World War II that commitment to Torah could not persist? Maybe for a couple individuals. But what do we see today? Where is the vibrant Jewish community? Where is the devotion to Torah? Where is there less concern, even though there should be more concern about future generations? Those aren't the Torah communities. And it's not that the predictions were wrong. The predictions were correct on the basis of logic. Commitment to Torah, the Jewish people should have come to an end long ago. Where do you find a nation that, and the Jewish people are a nation, where do you find a nation to survive 2,000 years of exile? It's because the Jewish people defy the laws of history. There was a professor at the University of Chicago, very famous professor of history, who wrote very much against the Jewish people, because the Jewish people did not act in the nature of the other nations. The other nations, when they conquered, there was a Professor Toynbee, the other nations, when they conquered nations, they were influenced by the nation that they conquered. At that time, Rav Herzog's son, Rav Herzog was the chief rabbi of Israel. So his son, who at that time was the Israeli ambassador to Canada, he challenged Toynbee to a debate. and he literally destroyed Toynbee. Toynbee was upset that the Jewish people did not follow the pattern, the historical pattern of the other nations. And Toynbee was exactly right. We do not follow the pattern of the other nations. But that's why we didn't crumble as a nation when all the other ancient nations crumbled as a nation. Because the laws of history do not apply to us in the same way they apply to the other nations of the world. That's the idea of Sukkot. Sukkot, to a certain degree, perhaps more than the other regalim, has a universal aspect. It's the harvest holiday. And the issue of understanding the significance of the harvest is something that is a universal thing. But Shmini Atzeres, there it's dedicated to the Jewish people. It represents the fact that the laws of history for the Jews, the laws of history do not affect the Jewish people in the same way as they affect the other nations of the world. We rise above Teva. We rise above nature. The laws of nature are not just laws of physical nature, they're laws of history as well. And I think this is also the idea behind Bris Milah. In a sense, when you take a look at from the beginning of Parshas Lech Lecha till Parshas Vayera, the idea of Lech Lecha is separation. Avram is told to separate himself. Separate himself from Ur Kasdim. Separate himself from Karan. Separate himself from his father's house. Separate himself from, he understands that he has to separate himself from Lot. Not that he didn't remain devoted. He certainly did remain devoted. He was devoted to all of mankind. And the separation didn't manifest itself in a lack of concern. As we see at the beginning of Parshas Vayera, how Abraham is the symbol of Gemilas Chesed, shows kindness to others as well. But the idea of Bris Milah, is there are two ways to influence people. One way to influence people is to become one with them. And the other way to influence people, on the contrary, is being distinct and separated. And in a sense, there was a challenge that Avraham Avinu faced. Avraham Avinu was dedicated to mankind and dedicated to the idea of bringing mankind closer to God. But the question is, what was the best way of accomplishing that task? As being one with them? Or no, being himself? And this is a dilemma that we face today. Universalism is very important. But the question is, does our Judaism emanate from our universalism, as I always mention, or our universalism emanates from our Judaism? And this was the dilemma that Avraham Avinu faced. And the conclusion of this idea of separation, not cutting oneself off, but recognizing that we have a special mandate, is based on the idea that our universalism has to emanate from our Judaism. And this was Bris Milah, represented the completion of that process. And this, I think, is the idea, being the 7 days, that represents creation. Creation is a universalistic concept. It was the creation of the whole world. Bris Milah represents, in a sense, that the Jewish people, in a sense, don't leave this world. But in a sense, they separate themselves. And in separating themselves, they become more devoted to others as well. That was the idea after the Bris Milah, as I mentioned many times. After Avram declared himself as separate, that was his gerus, his conversion, his becoming Jewish, whatever you want to call it. So he goes out of his way to help others as well, people who are not part of his group. And I think that now, what caused the enslavement of the Jewish people? What caused the enslavement of the Jewish people? Because the Jewish people, in a sense, being in Egypt, wanted to become like the Egyptians. What was the first mitzvah? At that time, it was before Matan Torah. The one mitzvah that the Jewish people had, although other mitzvahs were also observed, was the mitzvah of Bris Milah. And the Medrash tells us, and it seems clear from the Torah that way, that was the mitzvah that the Jewish people in Egypt stopped fulfilling because they wanted to be Egyptians. It's true. The Medrash tells us, they did not change their names. They did not change their clothes. They didn't change their language. But they wanted they saw different groups. And in Egypt at that time, there were a number of different groups. So they wanted to be Egyptians, Jewish Egyptians, but mainly Egyptians. And I think the Jewish people, at that time, they didn't listen to Moshe. Why didn't they listen to Moshe? Mikotza ruach me'avoda kasha. How will we understand the idea of mikotza ruach me'avoda kasha? One way to understand it is they felt there was no use. What's the purpose? And the truth of the matter is, the same thing is, we could understand in the beginning of Chumash Shmos, the Torah tells us, why is this Parsha stuma? Why is it a Parsha that there is no space? Vayechi, in beginning of Parshas Vayechi, why is it a Parsha stuma? Why is there no space? So nistamai nehem shel Yisrael mitzaras hashibud. The eyes of the Jewish people were closed because of the trouble of the shibud, because of the enslavement. What's the idea? The idea is that the Jewish people, in a sense, felt there are a number of possible explanations. One possible explanation is they felt that there was no more hope. Mitzaras hashibud. This is the way it has to be. And certainly as the enslavement became stronger and stronger, their only hope was to accept the situation. Why? Because when they saw themselves as Egyptians, they felt the laws of history that applied to the Egyptians applied to them also. And then another reason is because they saw themselves as Egyptians, they felt that once that really the Egyptians really liked them. It's only Paro that was the problem. That's why in Chumash Shemos, when Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim Vayanchu Bnei Yisrael Ma'avoda, when the king of Egypt died, so the Jewish people couldn't bear it any longer. Why? Rashi already asked the question. The Medrash asked the question. But the answer is very simple. The Jewish people thought, we are Egyptians. The Egyptians like us. We helped them. We cooperated with them. It's only Paro. But then they saw Paro died and their situation did not change. So they couldn't bear it any longer. So this is the merua, the kotzer ruach me'avoda kasha. So, and the answer is the Jewish people, the survival of the Jewish people is not dependent upon logic. So now, Vayitzavim, so the simple, I think, we could say, Vayitzavim el Bnei Yisrael vel Paroh Melech Mitzrayim lahotzias Bnei Yisrael meretz Mitzrayim. God commanded Moshe and Aaron to the Bnei Yisrael and to Paroh to take the Jewish people out of Egypt. Now, we understand the idea. Okay, Rashi already asked the question. We understand the idea of the command to Paroh. Actually, that's what was mentioned before. But why Vayitzavim el Bnei Yisrael? Why a command to the Jewish people? The answer is the Jewish people have to be ready to leave Egypt also. They have to change their attitude. They have to realize that their destiny is not dependent on the laws of history. So long as the Jewish people cannot perceive themselves as being free, Paro will not perceive himself as being able to free them. This is the Jewish people have to understand it. Now there is an interesting medrash. The medrash says, "Vayitzavim el Bnei Yisrael." What was the command to the Jewish people? Mechilta says the laws of Eved Ivri. The laws of of Eved Ivri. What's the idea behind it? And I think there's deep insight in this Mechilta. In other words, the law is what an Eved Ivri. Why all of a sudden? Eved Ivri doesn't come up till Parshas Mishpatim, a Jewish servant. But very often, a person who is oppressed, when he comes free, he adopts the identity and he imitates his oppressor of the past. And the Jewish people might have had a very bad self-image for the Jews. They could have seen the Jews as being someone who should be oppressed or could be oppressed. It was a bad self-image. And the Jewish people themselves are capable of becoming paros to themselves. And when you have an Eved Ivri, a Jewish servant, you might see yourself, you won't recognize it that way, but you might see yourself as a paro. There's a focus, don't be a paro. I once mentioned the Rambam in the Igros says, Paro hu hayetzahara. In one of the letters of the Rambam, he says, Paro is the Yetzirah. In other words, we have to look at Paro to realize who we should not become, because we are capable of becoming Paros also. Paro wanted slaves. Paro wanted Jewish slaves. He wanted the Jews enslaved. There are people within our community who want to control other people's lives. And they become paros as well. And so we have to be on guard, not to imitate Paro. And I mentioned that there is a concept. I'm not going to talk against the concept, but the misuse of the concept. There is a concept of Das Torah. And the idea of Das Torah is to seek guidance or to follow the guidance of those whose lives are immersed in Torah, those who are the great leaders of Torah. But I know of cases where people who are kiruv workers, people who are not the greatest scholars of the time, far from it. But there's an attitude, if I brought you close to Judaism, you have to do what I say. I control you. That's a Jew becoming a paro. It's one thing if Moshe Feinstein suggests that people act in a certain way. But we have to recognize where the line is drawn. There are people that, out of their arrogance and stupidity, think in regard to another Jew, that other Jew has to listen to them. One girl told me that she was about to get engaged to a certain fellow. And the person who was makarev her, the rabbi who was makarev her, who brought her close to observance, to religion, said about himself, did you check with Das Torah whether you can marry this person? Where do people get the chutzpah to say that? They become paros. It's important for us not to become paros. Yes, we teach Torah, we learn, but we have to know that we can't be paros. And we have to know that other Jews are not avodim, are not slaves. So this is this is Vayitzavim el Bnei Yisrael val Paroh melech Mitzrayim lahotzias Bnei Yisrael meretz Mitzrayim. The Jewish people have to free themselves. So we have to see ourselves as free on one hand. At the same time, we have to realize that every Jew is free. That every Jew is free. The problem with the Jewish people was that they had a very bad self-perception. They had a bad self-perception. And that's why they thought that there is no chance that they'll be able to come free. They thought they could only be slaves. Yetzias Mitzrayim gave us the mandate, first of all, that we are free, but not just that we are free, that every Jew is free. It's very interesting. At Pesach at the Seder, there is a custom that each person pours wine for the other person. In other words, it's not only important to see that you are free, but it's important to see that the other person is free. Why is it that Pesach at night, we act in a sense of royalty? Why? In order to see that we are free. Paro enslaved the Jew because he saw himself as the king of the Jews. So it's important for us to see ourselves free, but a person has to be doubly careful when you see yourself free. You have to see that the other Jews are free also. Now, this morning, when I was in shul, the question is, what was the purpose of the Aseres Hamakos? What was the purpose of the 10 plagues? Why was it necessary to be 10 plagues? And next week's Sedra, the Torah says, excuse me, Baal Paro kinich badeti eslibo veslei vavodav leman shishi osasael bekirbo leman tesaper bosnei bincha ben bincha. So God said it was to make a sign among the Egyptians, and it's a sign for you also to tell future generations. Unfortunately, the Jewish people sometimes are only impressed if there is an impact on the other people. The Jewish people, when they left Egypt, unfortunately, they still had a servile perspective. So it was important for the Jewish people to see the impact that the Makos had on the Egyptians before the Jewish people themselves could really be impacted by the effect of the Makos as well. Okay, I'll leave it here. That's I guess I can't hear you, so we'll have to leave it here. Okay. All right.